Hey there, members of the Night Crew, and folks who just love horror. Welcome to the Night Crew podcast, where shadows breathe and monsters listen. This is the podcast where we get cozy with the creepy, the frightening, and the just plain undead. I'm your host, Brad Ricks. Before we jump in, a quick reminder, the Night Crew 2 Bloodlust is now available on Amazon and on my website, bradricks.com. Oh, and I also have the Night Crew podcast t-shirts available. Order a book or two and a t-shirt. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jack Finn. He's the author of The 7 Deaths of Prince Vlad, as well as his latest release, Culling of the House of Boars. We talk folklore, history, and exploring monster myth in a whole new way. All right, so today I'm thrilled to have Jack Finn with me. Jack, how are you this evening?
Very good, very good. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm glad to have you. So I know we got a chance to chat a little bit before, we had a little bit of technical difficulties, which we have now overcome. So I got to learn a little bit about you, but of course, the listeners want to learn a little bit about you as well. So tell me about, tell me a little bit about you. How long you've been writing? What was your first book? What made you want to become a writer?
I always wanted to be a writer. Growing up, I was a voracious reader. I read a lot of horror, a lot of fantasy, and it was something that I just loved. It was such a transportive kind of feeling, and it was just something I always wanted to do. I wanted to be able to kind of give someone else that experience that I got from reading books. But it just never coincided life-wise with having that time to sit down and do it. And part of it is having the confidence to sit down and be like, wow, I could really put something down in print that's worthwhile. And my wife has been encouraging me over the last couple of years to no, stop talking about it. Just do it. And we'd taken a trip. She's originally from Romania. So we go out to Romania very often in the Transylvania area. And of course, out there, you have conversations about Dracula. And I said, I always loved the concept that history is written by the victors. So what if the story of Dracula was really the one that Van Helsing wanted us to know, And so my first book, the 7 Deaths of Prince Vlad, is really a re-envisioning in a very Hammer style kind of story of what that Dracula tale would have been like had it been Vlad really been the hero of the tale and Van Helsing and his cohorts the villains. So I delve into a lot of Romanian folklore, and it was a lot of fun. I wrote it initially to see hey, this is something I always wanted to do, and it was a cool concept we talked about. So I initially put it out through KDP, through Amazon, because I wanted to actually hand my wife a copy of the book that we had talked about for so long and written. And then the strangest thing happened. People started to buy it. People started to buy it and review it and liked it. And eventually, the year I put it out in 2023, and in 2024, a New Cheap Press approached me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in having us reissue this as a New Cheap Press product?" And I was like, "Well, yeah." That just kind of continued, gave me that extra bolster to continue writing. At that time, I was writing some short stories on Medium. And I expanded some of those things into much longer novels. It became my Wolves of Kalinin duology, and I've been writing ever since. And it's been a great experience, a lot of trial and error, but it's been a phenomenal journey. And now with my latest, my novelette coming out, The Culling of House of Boars, I've kind of revisited the vampire theme from a completely different approach, from a much more of an Eastern folklore approach. So it's been a fun journey.
Nice. So I know in there you mentioned, so your wife is from the Romania area. You've been to Transylvania a time or two and all that. So I do have to ask, have you seen Dracula's Castle? Have you? I have so I have not. So it is one of those things that is a very touristy kind of thing to do. They look at everyone that comes to visit, because he didn't actually live there. I think he was actually in prison there during one of his imprisonments. So they don't really view it as like Dracula's Castle. So when everyone comes to go through and see it, they kind of give you that side eye of like, here's another tourist. And so I try and blend as much as I possibly can for someone that doesn't speak the language in a foreign country. I guess I could see that would be a very touristy place to go to, and I'm sure they sell all kind of wonderful touristy trinkets and all that kind of stuff. But that does not knock it off the bucket list. Unfortunately, I still plan to. It's still a place I want to go. So it's kind of awesome. So another question then. So why horror?
It's funny. I think growing up, I didn't even realize I was a horror fan. I just liked certain types of movies. I like Jaws. I think the first couple of probably real horror movies I saw was Jaws, the car. I remember when it first came on to HBO, and I loved the Saturday creature features, everything from the Creature of the Black Lagoon, Gargoyles when it would come on. And they were I liked them. They were kind of spooky and scary, but they were fun. The story kept me engaged. I never really kind of pigeonholed myself thinking I'm a horror fan until you start talking to other people, right? Like, oh man, this movie was great. I watched Return of the Living Dead. I watched this. And they're like, oh man, I'm not into horror. And then you realize I guess I am. But, it's such a visceral experience. I think because growing up as a kid, especially watching and reading a lot of horror, you start thinking maybe there's something, something under the proverbial bed, right? But then you think wow, I'm just being a scaredy cat. And then you read Stephen King and you realize, there's something under the bed in this story. So maybe I'm onto something here. And so I just really enjoyed that. I love folklore. That is one of the things that really engages me a lot. And so a lot of my horror is folklore, really not from the perspective of the monster being the monster in the story. And I think that's, a lot of our horror is usually people encounter this creature from the past. I'm a little more fascinated by the creature of the past. And so I like to kind of delve deeper into that side than more so than the individuals that encounter it. And so I think it helps me to approach horror from and hopefully bring a little something different to the genre.
Yeah, folklore stuff is usually pretty good because you usually have a lot to work with and a lot of freedom to kind of go different routes on things.
Yeah, well, it's I feel that, when you watch a lot of horror movies, usually someone's stumbles across some, if you look at say The Ritual, right? In Adam Neville's The Ritual, where these guys go stumbling across into someone else's domain, really. And from their perspective, right, they're the ones that are being terrorized by the locals. But I always like to think, well, what about from the locals' perspective? Here come these four British dudes come stumbling into their area. And I like to always kind of twist the story around a little bit. And I think in a lot of the things that I wrote, it's more from that kind of perspective, that it's not woe is me, why is this creature coming after me? It's more of almost a comeuppance. This person has violated some ancient rules. They've that kind of invader concept of, this is I'm going to make this my land. I'm going to fence this off, and this is now my field to dig on and grow things on. And a lot of the horror I like to write is, well, this is the ramifications of those kinds of things. Of treading where you're not supposed to tread and taking things you're not supposed to take. It's not the monster that's the bad guy. It's the person that's kind of invaded that space that it is. And that's what I think what intrigues me about that aspect of horror.
That's interesting. Yeah, I like that kind of that different angle of it. And so it's more not so much the hapless, typical victim or whatever is really the victim as much as, they're the intruder. So yeah. That's interesting. I like that little twist on it. So who would you say are your biggest literary influences? I would have to say Gerald Brom. Growing up in the 80s, Brom was back when he was before he really started to write, when he was making his art. And I remember when he first put out, I think the first book I read of Brom's was The Child Thief, which was a re-envisioning of Peter Pan. And it really just kind of opened my eyes a little bit. Here, everyone knows the story of Peter Pan and all the fairy tales you grew up with. And Brom kind of twisted that story into something completely different, completely original, and much darker. And from there, I kind of look back at some of the fairy tales that we grew up on. And the original origin of those tales was much darker than, until it became Disney-fied. Right. They were Disney-ified, all the Grimm fairy tales. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I read Brahms' Krampus, where he kind of twists around where Santa is the bad guy and Krampus is the good guy, and then Slewfoot, which I think is one of my favorite folk horrors of all time. And so he just consistently puts out a very different approach. Like I said, I feel like back when he was writing for Dungeons and Dragons, but doing art for Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax, kind of felt like I grew up with Brom. And then to see him kind of enter the writing genre, I know who this guy is, and have loved his books. And that also, and he doesn't live that far from where I live now. It's kind of my childhood fantasy now of running into Brom in the grocery store and be like, Brom, it's Jack, and then him running the other way, I'm sure. But he is. But he consistently has been someone that I've always really enjoyed his things, and I thought he had a unique approach. And I feel like he's got a very unique voice in the horror space here. European-wise, I love David Barnett stuff. I just got my wife reading Withered Hill now and Scuttler's Cove, and he's got a Scratch Moss coming out next year. So it's definitely gravitate towards the folk horror genre.
So tell us a little bit about your writing process. Do you find yourself more as a pantser or a plotter? How do you how do you kind of map out what you do?
So I'm definitely more of a pantser in that regard. So usually what happens with me is I'll get a thought in my head about a particular scene of like, what if this happened? And then from there, the story kind of evolves both to the left and to the right. It's not necessarily I've got a thought of like, oh, what if these people did this? And then the journey kind of begins. Usually it's something that I think of a scene like, man, can you imagine if this happened or if that happened? What if someone's in a clearing and the wolf did this or the wolf did that? And that's usually somewhere in the middle of the book when I do ultimately write it. But that's the scene that kind of inspires me. I spend a lot of time, I live in the Pac Northwest, so I spend a lot of time in the woods. And so you get inspired. You sit there and I'll be by a waterfall or by a riverbed, and I'll think of like, well, what if this happened? And that kind of is what sparks the story usually. And from there, it'll build out, like I said, to the left and to the right and evolve. The Wolves of Kalinin, the duology that I just put out this year with the Nucci, Prey Upon the Lambs and The Desolation of Hunters, it started out really the penultimate scene, the confrontation between the hunters and the wolf, is what I first envisioned is just kind of like being inspired, kind of walking in the woods. And the rest of the story kind of gravitated. And I initially started to write it on Medium. And I said, oh, you know what? This is more than a single story. So I said, maybe I'll put it out as 3-4 episodes and kind of do it. But by the time I get to the fourth episode, I'm like, you know what? I really need to flesh this out. And ultimately wound up being 2 novels. And so I definitely am a loose gun when it comes to writing my stories. Where I start off and where I finish is usually far different than I intended. I've tried plotting. I've tried to, I've taken some master classes and I've worked through some other processes, but at the end of the day, it has to be what works best for you.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I've talked to a number of authors, and yeah, you have some who kind of do the little scaffolding thing. Others who are just like, nope, just start typing and see what happens. Yeah. And so, yeah, whatever you kind of find your process, and then that kind of becomes your process and what you do.
Yeah.
So I know. So at the time of this recording, I know it's on pre-order. It hadn't come out yet, but by the time this episode drops, it'll probably have been out for about a week or two. So, but you have a new book coming out called Culling of the House of Boars. So tell us a little bit about this new book.
So that also goes back to Romanian folklore before it was Romania, when it was still Dacia, before the Romans came in. And goes really to the origin story of the Strigoi, which is a Romanian version of the kind of the undead vampire that spawned the legend of Nosferatu and of Dracula. And really, at the time of the Roman conquest of Dacia, that they've created these creatures to kind of wreak havoc on the Roman invaders. And then it's kind of almost like Frankenstein's monster. It gets out of control of the Dacians and becomes something in and of itself, and they've formed clans. And so you kind of go through. Culling of the House of Boars is kind of it's a novelette, takes place kind of almost mid-story, at the point, not at the very beginning when the Strigoi are first unleashed upon the Romans, and not ultimately to their downfall at some point in the future, when they now become these wandering few that you encounter in the villages. So this is somewhere in kind of the episode 4, to use the George Lucasan approach, that you kind of come mid-story, that that there's stuff that happens before, and there's a lot that happens afterwards, and it gives you a snippet of a kind of a very Game of Thrones is kind of approach of these clans of Strigoi kind of vying for breeding space and for not necessarily to breed amongst each other, but to breed humans for food and hunting grounds, and the kind of conflict that takes place between them. And that's kind of where the story goes. So it's very different than my initial foray into vampirism with the seven deaths of Prince Vlad, but it's much more of a primal version of a vampire. It's yeah, I've had a lot of fun writing, and I'm looking forward to adding to both to the left and to the right of that storytelling, prequel and postquel, I guess what happened.
Nice. And so the official release date is November
4th.
November 4th. So yeah, so when this episode comes out, it'll probably been out 2 weeks or so. So, it's definitely been out in the world. So everybody, go take a look at it and get it. So, but yeah, I wanted to definitely chat about that for a second. So I know, so you have that one that's coming out, and your, first book, the Seven Deaths of Prince Vlad, both are vampires, but looking at the two and kind of how you have, I guess, talk a little bit about how you have kind of changed in your writing process, or how you kind of have seen yourself evolve from, book one to the book that you have coming out.
It's, I think I've kind of merged together my interests. I guess if you go back, when you first start writing, I think one of the biggest challenges as a writer is you start writing, you realize that what you're writing doesn't sound like anything that you're typically reading. Your voice is different. You don't sound like Stephen Graham Jones. You don't sound like Paul Tremblay. You don't sound like Brad Ricks. Like you're reading, you're writing, you think, wow, this doesn't sound like any of the authors I enjoy reading. And so at first you're like, well, what am I doing? And then you realize, hey, you know what? I don't want this to sound like any of those other people. I want it to sound like my own voice in the space. And once you kind of come to that realization, you just kind of have fun, and once you start having fun writing, it opens the aperture to, you sit there and think like, you know what? I want to write a story about this. And you have that confidence to be like, I can go out and I can do this and I could do that. When I wrote the Wolves of Kalinin, I think the big three, right? Growing up, you have Dracula, you have the werewolf, and you have Frankenstein. And those are kind of, as a kid, those are the holy trinity of monsters. And I think when you make any kind of foray into that arena, you really have to bring something unique. And so I love the idea of werewolves. I think the concept of that you combine a wolf and a person. The wolf itself is this feral primal creature, but it doesn't really encounter that evil aspect until you mix in the human aspect. And then you start getting the malice and things that you wouldn't normally encounter with an animal. So I always loved the concept of a werewolf. And then I thought, well, I don't want to just write another werewolf story. There's so many out there that sound so similar in the space. And so that's what prompted me. Ultimately, I kind of merged my love of history and of research, and I placed it in turn of the century Russia, in Tsarist Russia, in a Russian village, to kind of set in a completely different setting. And I did extensive research into, well, how would someone transform into a werewolf? And so I wound up researching some 19th century science books on metamorphosis, where they kind of talk about how they felt a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. It was really far more scientific than my brain can handle on a regular basis. But the concepts itself were really interesting. I said, you know what? If I merge these concepts into a werewolf story and kind of give hey, this werewolf changes in a different way than what we're used to seeing, then I felt like I'd kind of bring something different to the table. And that's kind of, and so I was able, I hope I was successful in doing that. I've got some pretty good feedback on the story. And so I like to kind of look at things that have been visited and then revisit from a completely different angle. Like I said, for vampire stories, there's Vlad was a completely different re-envisioning. So it was almost like a fun kind of Hammer-esque kind of view of vampires, of a vampire story. But I didn't really delve into any kind of serious vampire mythos when I wrote it. It was really just a re-envisioning of the Dracula. And I think it's a really fun tale. With Culling, the House of Boars, I said, let me create something new that is a completely different mythos to vampires, that my vampires are different in the space than other vampires. And that's kind of how I think I've evolved. I'll look at a story and I'll say, all right, well, how do I make this unique? How do I make this my own? How do I make it when it says wow, that sounds like something Jack Finn wrote?
And I mean, finding your voice, I think, is something that every author, as you kind of, the more you write, the more you kind of start fine tuning your craft. You're doing it. You're kind of finding your voice of things. You've talked before on this podcast and others that, outside of writing, I'm a musician. I play guitar. But, when I first learned to play guitar, all I was doing is copying Jimmy Page riffs or Jimi Hendrix or, Eddie Van Halen or whatever. But it's as you practice and you start taking all of the different kind of influences and you start melding them together, you start kind of finding your own sound. And it's very similar in writing as well, that as you are writing, you usually kind of start off almost trying to mimic, how a King or how Poe or how, whoever does it. But the more and more you're doing it, you kind of start peeling away their layers and you kind of start finding your own way of saying things and way of storytelling and way of doing it.
Exactly. And it's it's liberating. Once you kind of reach that point where you don't feel that you read it and you realize that it sounds like you. And what always astounds me is that when other people read it and it sounds like me and they enjoy it. I know I enjoy when I write something, but it's but as a storyteller, that's really what you want. I love when I do encounter someone that has read something that I've written, whether it's one of my books or one of my short stories, and they've envisioned it in a completely different way than I wrote it. They have the same gist of the story of what I wrote, but how they envision characters or how they envision scenes is very different than I envisioned it when I wrote it. And to me, I love that, because that means that they've taken the story, which is really what I want to get across, and they've made it their own. They've made it more meaningful to them, but how they envision it in their head. That's such also an interesting effect, when you have there, because when you're writing, you think to yourself, you don't want to describe too much, right? Because you want to give them the idea so they can envision what you're saying, but you don't want to over describe it to the point that they have to see it the way you say it. Right. And so when you write it, you really just want to get the story out there and someone to hear a good story and like a good story and walk away with it feeling partly their own.
Yeah, definitely. I know that I have a bad habit of wanting almost to get into that over description. And I almost have to remind myself, kind of shifting medias into like movies. There are, to me, one of the goriest scenes is a scene that's not even gory at all, but it's because you make it gory. And that's in the original Night of the Living Dead. There's a scene where the lady's running and she falls, and all you're doing is seeing the camera angle up and all the zombies reaching down. You don't see what's happening, but in your head, you're picturing everything that they're ripping apart of her. And it becomes a very gory scene without having shown a bit of gore at all.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the essence of horror, right? So much horror lays within the fears that are in our head. So you want to kind of like touch and poke and tweak those fears in people's minds without like inundating them with your own fear on top of it. You want to kind of touch upon it. You want to hit that pull that thread, and they'll let it unravel in their own mind the way that they want it to be. And it's like we were talking about Night Crew before. There's things when I read it that like really stuck out to me as so like I could picture it in my head based upon things that I've experienced. And so to me that's one of the things that I love about the book, aside from the story overall, is that there's aspects of it that I feel like are embedded now in myself, because I remember scenes. Not vampire hunting scenes, but I do remember scenes that you touch upon in the book, and that resonates with me as a reader, and that makes the book different than something you just read and don't think about twice. And that's what I'm looking forward to your release coming up as well.
I appreciate that. So, what do you find is the most difficult part of writing a book?
The most difficult part, without a doubt, is you get in the meat of it, you start writing, things are going well. And then you get another idea about something completely different that you want to write, right? And now you're mired down. You've poured yourself into the story. You love the story you're writing, but at the same time, you got this other idea that you feel really jazzed about, want to start writing on. And so, especially when I'm working on anything that's longer, some of the longer works, you get through it, and you get kind of that little slog piece where you're like, all right, this is getting close to where I want to get this story to be, but I'm not there yet. And then suddenly something else inspires you, and you're like, man, I've got to finish this before I can start that. Otherwise, I'd have a whole laptop full of unfinished stories.
That always reminds me of that meme of like the guy who had his arm around the girl, but then is also kind of looking back at the other one. It's like this is my current work in progress, but you're looking towards that. But that's another story idea I like.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I could wake up each morning and start something new, and then never finish anything I started, because there's always something new that sparks my interest. So I've got a whole book full of ideas that I try and jot them down while they're still fresh in my mind, and then go back to finish what I'm working on.
Yep, I do the same thing. I have a notes doc in my phone. As I come up with something, I'm like, oh, I got to write this down. So I have a whole bunch of like little one-liners that at someday that one-liner may turn into $100,000, if only 100,000 word, word book. Yeah. So as I do the same thing, as I think of it, I'm like, I'm going to write it down, and that way later on I remember it and come back to it.
Yeah, I email myself lines. Like if I picture a scene and I'm thinking through it, and I'm like, this is really what I don't want to forget this part. I'll email the quote to myself that I want to make sure that I include in there. And I think to myself, if anyone ever hacked my email, they'd be like, what is wrong with this guy? He's sending himself all these weird things about like hacking this up, or the monster comes this way, or the werewolf comes there. And so, yeah, I've got a litany of odd emails to myself over the last 2-3 years of all half thought ideas and scenes.
Well, that's kind of like the old, hopefully no one ever looks at my Google search history. Yeah, I had somebody, she came up to me at one of the author cons, and she was making little short videos and doing interviews for authors. And one of the questions she asked is, what's the strangest thing that you've had to look up for, in your Google search? And I told her, I was like, yeah, mine was, how long it takes to dissolve a body. And I was like, because that is not something you should know off the top of your head. It's like, if you just randomly know that's an issue.
I've looked up how long someone will survive if put into medically induced paralysis and so I've looked up in like great detail the different stages of death that are there. So yeah, if there is someone watching the internet for potential malactors, that's going to pop up in someone's radar, and someone's going to be like, man, this guy's looking to kill someone.
Oh man, so much fun. Horror authors, I should say, and our search history. So, all right. So another thing though, I know we've been talking about like Culling of the Boars, and that's coming out, or Culling of the House of Boars. Sorry. But you also just recently, if I recall, you have gotten picked up by Crystal Lake.
I did. They just picked up in this last open call my He Who Has Done Evil, which starts off in South Africa during the Anglo-Zulu Wars, and then goes into and ends kind of in the trenches of Antwerp during World War I. And it's a kind of also based in some African folklore about some demonology and folklore about what follows these soldiers after they leave one battle space, and as much older, more seasoned veterans kind of it catches up to them during World War I. And so I sent it to Joe, and I thought if anyone is going to like a South African war horror story, it's going to be Joe Meinhardt. And luckily he did. And I'm really thrilled to collaborate with this. Is my first one with Chris Lake, and hopefully the first of many more to come.
So I will say, they've done the Night Crew series, and they have been awesome to work with. So definitely congratulations on becoming part of the Crystal Lake family, because like I said, they've been a blast.
I'm looking forward to it. I really am.
Be looking forward to the number of rounds of edits and proofreaders, because wow, they got a lot, which is helpful. I love each and every one of you who proofread and edit my stuff, because you just make it better. But holy crap, there's a lot, which is probably more so on me that I can't seem to, get my stuff right. But
I never realized how poorly I wrote the English language until I had editors start to review my work. The only reason most of my stuff sounds halfway illiterate is I've used Twisted Thorn has been my editor for Culling in the House of Boars, and for Wilson that I've got coming out. And right now working with Edgeweaver for my Book of Alice duology, it came back with read over the page. But each edit that I read, I was like, wow, this is so introspective and so much. It made the story so much better.
Yeah.
I look forward to to submitting something to the editor. I'm sure it drives them crazy, but I look forward to it coming back with all kinds of like changes and questions and things like that, because there's, you read your story so many times that you really miss the forest for the trees. You think, you tell the story you think you want to tell until someone else reads it and says, well, what about this? And what about that? And would that character really say this and do this in that setting? You're like, you're right. And I don't think I've ever looked at it. I think every time I've sat down with something that has been professionally edited, every time I'm much happier with the finished product by far. And I'm very thankful for those people that make me sound literate, because clearly on my own, I am not. But yeah, it is a, I hear horror stories about some people that get really offended when the editors make their changes and stuff. I think that's part of the learning process as an author, to realize that, like, hey, you want someone to really tear into this like Jaws. You want them to tear that boat up, and you want to defend it. If you could tell them, like, no, this is why this makes sense, and you take those constructive criticisms, it will be a far better story. And yeah, I'm looking forward to each editorial team I've worked with. I've been really thankful for the extensive amount of time they've put in to make me sound better, because the finished product the story is so much tighter, and it's much better to have an editor figured out than someone read your book and have those same thoughts and criticisms. So right. I'm very thankful for that process.
Yeah. And like I said, it's a great team to work with. So again, like I said, congratulations on joining the Crystal Lake family. So,
Thank you.
All right. So last question before I get into the one that's always my favorite question. So what scares you, and how does that inspire your writing?
That is a very, very long list. I think everything that comes out in my writing is something that either has currently or has in the past scared me. I mean, it goes back to, I used to take the garbage out as a kid, in suburban New York. And I used to think to myself, like, well, maybe there's something in the woods there. And then I think to myself, no, that's crazy. And then I think that's exactly what those people that get attacked by werewolf thought, like, that it's crazy to think there's something in the woods. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much out there. I don't know if there's one particular thing that scares me more than others. Because I think when I write, a lot of times I kind of lean on the side of the creature as more hero than villain. So I'm less afraid, I think, of the monsters that I write than of probably the humans that they are inflicting whatever deprivations upon. One of the things, and I know we've talked about it before, I've deployed 3 times to Afghanistan, and I don't think there's anything scarier than what humans do to each other. And I think that really impacted my worldview when it comes to writing about who the real villain of my stories are. I think when in Wolves of Kalinin, more often than not, you're going to side with the werewolf rather than the person that is being attacked. And I think that comes out a lot in my writing, that we demonize all these things that we say were myth and folklore and stuff. But I'm not sure that the modern day representation of what we've got is any better than anything that we were afraid of in the past. And so I think that comes out pretty strongly in most of my tales.
Yeah. And I would definitely agree. It's like the reason I named my debut novel Fear Not the Dead, what I did is I took that as a spin from the, don't fear the dead when the living is so much worse. Yeah. And so yeah. I took that don't fear the living or don't fear the dead, at beginning of that, and kind of spun it to Fear Not the Dead because it had a little better ring to it. But the whole concept, especially as you read the book, is that, yeah, it's set in a haunted house and there are ghosts and stuff, but those aren't the real things you need to be scared of. There is an antagonist. There is there's bad people to be afraid of more so than even the ghosts that are there.
Yep. Yeah, and that's very much the take I had in the Wolves of Kalinin duology. Is that I think when you read the story, I mean, there's definitely a monster in the tale, but I don't necessarily. And there's antagonists in the tale, and then there's villains in the tale, and I think that there's once you get to the end, you can easily pick out like, okay, this was the monster, and this was kind of the person that or person or people that kind of oppose the protagonist in the story, but these people are the clear villains. Almost in most of my stories, it's almost never the creature or at least the creature is never the worst person in the book. There's I could say. But that's one of the things that makes gives me a lot of joy as a horror writer is you can really bring the worst that you've seen people, put it on paper, and then they get what they deserve. Yeah.
So I definitely agree, and those takes on it and kind of spinning the typical tropes almost on their head like that, or it's very creative, and I'm definitely there's a couple I'm gonna have to check out of yours then. So I'm at the 7 Deaths of Prince Vlad definitely has my interest for sure. So all right, so I'll jump into the question I really like, which is so I started the Night Crew podcast as a spinoff to my own series, The Night Crew, which is about a team of monster hunters, and all of my scripted episodes I do deep dives into some kind of a creature. So with that being said, Jack, what is your favorite horror monster?
I think that's a good one. It's such a large, the pantheon of things that run wild in my head on a regular basis is pretty extensive. I've never been big into the demons and those kinds of like possession novels or any of that kind of stuff. Was never something that really kind of sparked my interest. I think my favorite is probably going to say folk horror overall. Those the ancient the ancient gods and ancient creatures that have come back in one way, shape, or form. James Brogdon did it really well in Bone Harvest. I think we see it in the Cunning Folk from Adam Neville. To me, that is I love the concept that our world is built upon the ancient world. They've now predated humankind, biologically modern humans, to over 900,000 years ago. And we've pretty much discounted everything except for the last roughly 2,500 years. So I like to kind of delve into, I think that my favorite part is what's existed before. And that just like weeds grew up through cracks in the pavement, those creatures from the past, as we tread upon what used to be theirs, break through into our world, and that there's ramifications for those things. That is probably what sparks my interest. There is, I'm a huge reader of world folklore, and I love when I see commonalities in some places with things. Whistling at night is very big. Don't whistle at night in Romania. You'll be chased out of town. But you see that also in a lot of Native American folklore too. Nick Medina's book is about that, and Shane Hawk has written about that. That I think what came before the modern world is what, as a creature and as a pantheon of creatures, is what fascinates me far more than any kind of devil or demon or any of the modern stuff. And so I think even with Culling in the House of Boars, I go back to that prehistory era vampire for the basis of the story more so than a modern Count Dracula.
Gotcha. Well, and I know, so as you were saying that and talking about some of the gods from before and all that, funny part, one of the movies that came to mind in that, kind of a comical take of that almost is Cabin in the Woods, where, every so often where they're having to do this ritual to make sure that they keep the ancient demons, or the ancient gods, appeased or, at bay. And so, it's more of a, almost comedic take on it, but it's definitely, it's one of my favorite movies. I love Cabin in the Woods.
That is a great movie. That is an absolutely great movie.
So other kind of, what other, either from a movie or book standpoint, would you recommend when, if somebody's interested in learning more about, or just, things in regards to those that were before kind of stuff?
I think there's two schools of thought really when you have it. You have the kind of old continental kind of folklore, where I think the concept that you see like in especially like in the British Isles is that there is a village that still adheres to the old, very, very Wickermanish, that there's a community that still adheres to the old way. You see it in Withered Hill. You see it in Adam Neville, The Cunning Folk, and in The Ritual. And that is really the kind of folklore aspect that you see from a lot of European stuff. I think on the American side, it's very much so like you see in the movie The Witch or in Gerald Brahms' Slewfoot, where you encounter something in the woods that's there. It's something is imposing itself upon the community, where it's an intruder that comes into the community, whether it's the devil or something, some ancient creature, a Wendigo, whatever it may be. European style wise, it's someone from the outside coming into the community, like Sophie Wickham in Withered Hill. And so I think there's two very different approaches. I think it's really interesting to watch. I've made the argument before that my first folk horror was Watership Down, but about the dark pastoral of rabbits trying to survive in Britain. But I think that's where I would go. I love Slewfoot and Krampus by Gerald Brom. Like I said, he's been a favorite writer of mine. I think that really gives you a thought-provoking spin, because it's very similar to that. Like I said, Krampus is good and Santa is evil. And I think there's a really cool spin on that in the book Krampus. And in Slewfoot, you definitely root for the witch and the forest creature more so than the Puritans. So I really love his approach to writing. On the other side of the continent, like I said, Adam Neville, and pretty much everything by Adam Neville I think is good, or David Barnett. And I'm a huge James Brogdon fan. And so, yeah, any of those I think are great folk horror places to start.
Nice. All right. Awesome. So outside of writing, what are your hobbies?
I'm an avid hiker and kayaker. And I think during both those times, it really, when you're out on the water or in the woods, you really get the sense that you're in someone else's domain. This is not your everyday world where you can get in your car and you can drive someplace and do something. When you're in more remote places, you really get a sense for how small humanity is in the big picture of things. And I think that fuels a lot of the folk horror stories I write. And when you realize that how much you are at the mercy of what's around you, like in Max Brooks's Devolution, you know what I mean? Like here's this little community that builds up on the side of Mount Rainier, which is literally, I could see out my window right now until the Bigfoot come from down the hill. And so I think when you're out in the woods, and especially as someone that writes folk horror, that is a big inspiration for me. And that's where I spend most of my free time. I like to both my wife and I like to kind of get away from the rat race, get out where it's just us with the dogs in the woods, or get out on the kayaks out in the water. And as not a strong swimmer, being out on the water is always something that instills fear in me for in a place that has apex predators and in the waters around here. So that's pretty much what I do in my free time, as well as obviously read and write.
Awesome. So any lasting advice for aspiring authors?
One of the best pieces of advice that I got was when I wrote The Seven Deaths of Prince Vlad. And it was in a critical review. Someone left me an Amazon review. So if you go on there, it's still there. And he said that he liked the tale, liked the story, but he felt that, he never felt that the characters were in danger enough. He felt that the good guys were the good guys and the bad guys were the bad guys. And he kind of knew that the good guys would triumph and the bad guys would die and all those kinds of things. And so I took that to heart. And I think when you read my stuff now, there's a lot of carnage on both sides of the aisle. That is some of the not necessarily criticism, but some of the comments I get in emails on Prey Upon the Lambs of like, how could you kill this character? I love this character, and you killed him so horribly. But that's one of the things, when you write, you really care for the characters you write about, and killing them off is sometimes a hard thing, but you've got to kind of cross the Rubicon on that. You've got to be willing to, and I mean, you watch Game of Thrones, right? You have to have that mental red wedding of some serious bloodletting among your cast of characters, and because that keeps readers, wondering what's going to happen next, and keeps them on their toes, and that feeling of that nobody is safe. And so I would say that when you write, you're gonna, especially the first book you write, you're gonna love your characters. You're gonna want this. You're gonna have a story arc in your head, but don't go easy on the bloodletting. Not everyone makes it to the end, and that's an important lesson. I thought that was great advice. If I ever came across that person, I would thank. It was still a pretty good review, but I thought that was a great piece of advice. And I would tell that, let your own voice come out, and tell the story you want to tell, but make the hard choices. When there's
throw some carnage in there.
Yeah, I mean, there are characters I love to write. Sometimes I love to write a character that I despise, and I look forward to the kill scene. Then there are other characters that really just feel like, man, I could feel like I write books about this guy, but the story arc's got to end in a certain way to elicit the kind of emotion that you want to from the reader and in the story, and so you got to do those tough things sometimes.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. In the first book I wrote, there is a character that dies towards the end. And what's funny is in a book club that I'm part of, they all read it and they're like, no, you should have killed this other person. And I'm like, really? They're like, yeah, he deserved to die. I was like, all right, so up the carnage. But in an art group that I have for the night crew, I was like, okay, so if I have to kill a member of the night crew, and like everybody in my art group was like, no, you don't. You don't have to kill a member of the night crew.
There's a good amount of carnage in the night crew among the protagonists.
Yeah, they were like, no, you don't have to kill any of them. I was like, if I have to, if between, Mike and Nate and Nikki and Thomas or Josh, I was like, if any of them needs to die, who's it going to be? They're like, none. It's like, don't you dare.
It always reminds me of, I always think of the movie Armageddon, in the scene where Bruce Willis and all them are walking to the very beginning, and you've come at that point to really like most of the characters in the movie,
Mm-hmm.
They're very endearing. And then you juxtapose that with the scene at the end where the few survivors are there. And it's a pretty poignant scene. And I always think to myself, they did a really good job in a very bubblegum kind of movie of making you care about a character and then killing them in wholesale. And that makes for a good story. Definitely. But yeah, it is a tough thing to do as a writer. I have gotten more than one email of people that said, I can't believe you did that. I'm so mad. But I guess that's good. You've engaged them. If someone is mad enough that you killed the character to send you an email, then I guess that's success, right?
Yep. You've elicited an emotion, which as writers, that's what we want to be able to do. So yeah, definitely. Yep. And I think also that's called, I think you heard it called, kill your darlings.
Yeah.
So, yep. Yeah,
it's true. It's I mean the writing as a journey is a really interesting thing. It's different for every person, but everybody when you sit around, you look back, you see how far you've come. You see all the different bridges you've crossed and rivers you've crossed to get where you are. And it's a tough road. This is definitely a tough business, but it is worth it. It's one of those things you have to believe in yourself and kind of keep driving forward. And I was just talking to Christopher Michael, who also just got picked up by Crystal Lake for his Danforth series. And we were talking years ago. He's one of the first writers that kind of came across for writing. And we both at that point had been self-published. And I said, could you believe, years ago when we were like, oh man, this is a tough business. And literally we signed within a month of each other with Crystal Lake, which was at the top of both of our wish list. And we just kind of were talking about, man, what a crazy journey this is. It's everything between social media and reviews and Amazon and Goodreads. It is a crazy, crazy road to take and a difficult one at times, but it is such a cool experience. I hope that everyone that's out there that listens, that wants to write a book, sits down and does it. They'll listen to the naysayers. It's kind of like Bob Dylan, right? Bob Dylan, they used to tell him that no one's gonna like the sound of your voice. It sounds too gravelly and stuff. But I mean, he believed in himself and became a big rock star. And to this day, is why do we know? And there's 8 billion people on Earth. There's going to be a percentage that like whatever you write, as long as you get it edited well. There is an audience out there for every story. If it entertains you as a writer, it's going to entertain someone as a reader. And whether it's a wide audience or a niche audience, the journey is being a storyteller. The fact that you could tell a story and someone could read it and enjoy it, let alone buy it, which always boggles my mind. That is an incredible thing. That is something that, as a little kid, I dreamed of doing. I've dreamed of someone having my book on their shelf or having sitting there having my book in their hand. And I would encourage everyone. Everyone's got a story in them, and every story is worthwhile. Like I said, all mine need to be heavily edited for greater literacy. And I think people should embrace that process and drive forward.
Awesome. Yeah, couldn't say it better myself. All right. So with that, where can my listeners learn more about you?
So I'm on all the socials under at the real Jack Finn. So you can find me. I'm mostly on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, and www.therealjackfinn.com. I've got my website, and they can find out about my books, and I'll post the podcast link on there as well. So I'm on everything but TikTok. I'm not on TikTok at the moment.
Not a TikToker, huh?
Not at the current moment. That is
yeah. When I started on TikTok, the first thing I did, I went to my teenage daughter. I was like, "How do I work this app?" So that was my training session on it. And so I've been trying to get better on TikTok. But yeah, it's definitely a different little environment there.
That is my next bridge to cross at some point. But yeah, right now I'm pretty much on all the socials.
Well, I'll make sure and include those in the show notes. So anybody's listening, make sure check the show notes. You'll find where you can, find all the information about Jack. And, definitely, like I said, by the time this episode comes out, his brand new book will be out as well. So, make sure you go over, download it, and, either buy a physical copy, download it, do however you would like to read it, and, read it, review it, all that kind of good stuff. So, other than that, Jack, it's been a pleasure chatting with you and having you on. I'm glad we overcame all of our little technical issues that we were having at the beginning. But all in all, had a great conversation, and it's been nice to hang out and get to know you for a little bit.
Very cool, man. Same here. Definitely. I look forward to Night Crew 2 coming out.
Yeah, November 14th. So yeah, it'll actually, by the time this episode comes out, it'll probably have just came out. So as well. So now get both of our books.
I agree.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. But again, thank you everybody for listening. And, thanks for hanging out with me for a little while, Jack.
Yeah, thank you, man. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's it for the Night Crew podcast and my conversation with Jack Finn. I have links to where you can find Jack in the show notes. Follow him on all the socials and pick up his books. So if you had a good time, make sure to follow the show, share it with a friend, and leave a rating, hopefully 5 stars. If you want updates on my writing, you can follow me on Facebook or TikTok at Bradrick's Author. You can find copies of my novels wherever you like to buy books. But if you hop over to my website, bradricks.com, you can purchase signed copies of any of my novels. Speaking of, the Night Crew Book 2 is now available. Get your copy today if you haven't already. I'm Brad Ricks, reminding you to stay out of graveyards after dark, question people who don't show up in mirrors, and just learn to embrace the folklore. Until next time, keep your curtains drawn, your sense of humor sharp, and your blood inside your body. Thanks for listening.